This presentation was prepared in response to the 9 March 2020 directive for UP faculty to undertake academic contingency planning in light of the COVID-19 emergency and prior to the 17 March 2020 suspension of residential and online classes and alternative learning activities in all UP campuses except the UP Open University. The aim of the presentation is to provide a quick guide to instructional planning for remote teaching of lecture-based courses. Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone's safe at home instead of out. I'm at the office, but that's because of the emergency stuff that needs to be done. This morning, I'm supposed to be sharing with you some thoughts on the design of technology-supported learning, and I'd like to contextualize it. It's really designing technology-supported learning in the time of COVID-19. Okay, so I'm going to share with you some thoughts on what we need to do given that we cannot meet our classes for an extended period of time. And really, this pandemic has taken over our lives. So we need to figure out how to survive and try and continue doing what we need to do. So the context and rationale is, as everyone knows, the Office of the Vice President for Academic Affairs came out with a couple of memoranda highlighting the urgent need to shift to alternative learning modes in light of COVID-19. In particular, the fact that we have had to shut down the university and stay home. But in addition, we really need to be planning how to continue teaching and learning in the event of other disasters, right? Because it's really not just this particular disease, it's a lot of different things that can result in school closures. So essentially, the broader context would be to look at academic contingency planning as an aspect of disaster risk reduction and management. But more broadly still, I'd like to underscore that really we cannot stop learning because learning is vital to our survival. You might have heard one of the more famous American politicians, or infamous, depending on your point of view, say this line: we need scientists, not beep, 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 in charge of the coronavirus response. I've broadened that to say that, the word scientists really refer to learned men and women. And it's not just, as I said, it's not just the coronavirus response, but other disaster response. Because learning is vital to survival, this partly, for me, explains why education is a right. And we must insist on being able to respect that right. And those of us who have the duty to provide education must continue to do so as far as we can and as best as we can. So our objective is to ensure the continuity of learning in the event of school closure through rapid adoption of technology-supported alternative delivery modes, including, but not limited, to online teaching and learning. So my use of these terms is deliberate. Okay, so let's begin with the definition of terms. I am deliberately using the broad term alternative delivery modes, which the term refers to non-conventional instructional methods. Why? What do we mean by non-conventional? So to get that, we need to define conventional. Okay, conventional or traditional instruction is face-to-face, classroom-based teaching and learning. Okay, so this is what we normally do if there would be no suspension of classes. We meet our students in a physical classroom. The other term in my previous articulation of our objective is technology-supported teaching and learning. And that is basically using information and communication technologies, or ICTs, in order to teach and to learn. But technology-supported learning is also a broad term. It applies to the use of technology both inside the conventional classroom or in face-to-face teaching, as well as the use of technology in situations where there is a distance, a physical or geographic distance between the teacher and the learner, and they are not in the same classroom. So basically what I'm talking about is what is known as distance education. Defined simply, distance education, or DE, is simply a mode of education where the teachers and the learners are geographically or physically separated most or all of the time. Okay? And online learning, which is learning that is supported by or delivered via the internet, is only one type of distance education. If we did not have the internet, we can still do distance education. And this is an important thought to keep in mind. Okay, so our task, okay, is really how to redesign our courses in order to be able to deliver them outside of the regular classroom. In a situation where schools are closed and we cannot meet our students in school. So it's basically, to repeat, it's how to redesign. And I say the word redesign, I use the word redesign because basically we have already designed our courses, I presume. At the beginning of the semester or just before the semester started, you designed your courses, except that you designed it for delivery in a conventional way. Now we are needing to redesign our courses for an alternative mode of delivery. Design basically involves a number of steps, but the most basic step is to analyze the situation. What is our situation? What is the scenario? And at this point, I'd like to address very specifically a scenario where schools are closed. So what does that look like? One, face-to-face classes are suspended. Not all students have personal computers. Whether these are desktops or laptops or tablets. Okay. Some students have zero internet access. Most, if not all, students have a mobile phone, although not all of these would be smartphones. Some of the towns where our students reside, we made them all go home, remember, just before the lockdown. Hopefully they got home before the lockdown. Some of their hometowns have poor mobile network signals. And in what is euphemistically referred to as a community quarantine, which is really a lockdown, there are restrictions on travel, even within the same municipality, and people would not be allowed to congregate. And we are supposed to observe social distancing. Additional characteristics of the school closure scenario are the following. Most, if not all, of our students have not experienced technology-supported formal learning, okay, outside of a conventional classroom. Meaning to say, it is possible that in your conventional classroom, you may have used some form of technology, and you may even have done some online learning, for example, making them answer an online survey, but you did that in the classroom while you were there to supervise. This particular feature that I am referring to in the school closure scenario is that most of our students will likely not have had to engage in formal learning on their own without the teacher or you being physically present to provide supervision. But it's not just our students who have that handicap. It's also some, if not most, teachers. We have not necessarily experienced what it's like to provide technology-supported teaching at a distance, where our students are at home and we are also at home. Uh, and even more true is the fact that most of us, if not all of us, have not learned at a distance. We have not experienced being students studying without our teachers present, and being able to interact with our teachers only using communication technologies. So this is the scenario. It's very important to remember, because when we design, we are designing for a particular context. There is no such thing as a generic design. Um, okay, so now what would be the procedure, therefore, in designing technology-supported learning? On the screen, you will see the procedure. I started out with four steps, but ended up, for the sake of clarity, um, disaggregating the steps. So that the first thing really is identifying and prioritizing the course topics that we would like to deliver during the period when we cannot meet our students in the classroom. The second is to write the detailed course guide or syllabus for those topics that we would like to deliver at a distance. The third is preparing the course packs or the learning packages for those topics. And the fourth is selecting the communication tool or platform for delivering these particular course components. The fifth is organizing the learning environment, which means setting up the activity or the learning activity on the selected tool or platform. And finally, doing a dry run or trial implementation in order that to be able to refine the design before we actually have to deliver it. So let's talk about some of these things. First, prioritizing. What does that mean and how do we do that? I propose that we can prioritize by asking ourselves some questions. One is, what do students really need to know in the next 2 to 3 weeks? And I say 2 to 3 weeks because we're looking at that length of time. Based on the most recent memorandum from the Vice President for Academic Affairs, we are to suspend formal learning, face-to-face or online, until April 14 or April 12, or until after the Holy Week. So the question now is, what do our students really need to learn in the next 2 to 3 weeks? And then what do they need to know first? What do they need to know next? And then what do they need to know last? In other words, what is the sequence in which these really need to know topics should be taken up? And then for each item in your priority list, we need to ask the question, what is the worst thing that could happen if we do not teach this topic, or if this topic is not learned by our students? What's the worst case scenario? Okay, asking the consequence of not knowing something is very important for us to determine how important that particular something is. And finally, if you could pick only one topic for your students to learn, which topic would that be? If you were allowed 2 or 3 topics only, which topics would those be? It's really important to answer the first question, if you could pick only one topic. Okay, and that is because sometimes that's all we really have time for. And given the constraints that our students are facing, or some of them at least, if we will need to be able to figure out what is the most important thing, and if that is the only thing they learned, what is that going to be? So this is these. You can think of other questions for prioritizing, but it's really important that we learn to prioritize, because we cannot take up everything at this time of grave risk and danger to our health. Um, the other thing that was mentioned was the need to prepare the detailed course guide. Once you have identified the priority topics, um, then we need to lay it out in the form of a detailed plan, okay, where we talk about what the target learning outcomes are for each topic, and we identify the learning resource or resources that our students will need to study in order to achieve those learning outcomes for that topic, and the learning activity that they will need to engage in using those resources in order to achieve the target learning outcome for that topic. So this is a sample matrix. It doesn't have to be horizontal. It just helps if you put it in a matrix. But ultimately, the final guide is really like the syllabus that we know, which is quite detailed. Okay. Now, the other thing that we need to think about is the choice of communication tool or platform. Given the scenario that I described earlier, where some, if not most of our students would have limited access to the internet, especially, but even sometimes a gadget on which to do their work, meaning to say a computer or a tablet, we will need to think about the range of technologies that are available and that we can make use of. You can plot technologies on some kind of a spectrum from the low-tech type of technology, zero or very low barrier to accessing it and using it, all the way up to really high-tech kind of scenario. And these would, under the circumstances, include tools that are online. Given that we have very poor internet connectivity in the country generally, and especially in the hometowns, the rural areas where many students reside. So this table is just an example of the types of learning activities that we might have in mind, and how we might be able to deliver them using low-tech tools on the one hand, and using online, more sophisticated tools if they were available. You can add to the list, and you can even change some of the entries. The point is simply that we must be able to think about how to do a particular learning activity given the tools that are available. So, for example, it may be very difficult at this time to do a discussion, especially a synchronous discussion, but it is not impossible. And if you really, really must discuss, then you can consider a scenario where you're discussing with a few students at a time using your phone, and not necessarily using an online platform. Um, when it comes to an activity where you're asking them to reflect on a question, it doesn't have to be online, does it? You could simply ask them to write out their reflection on pen and paper and think about how they might share it with you and with their classmates at a later date. The other thing in that list of things, steps to follow is, of course, the course pack. Once you have identified your priority topics and you have written out your detailed plan, and you have figured out which communication tool to use for which particular learning activities, we will need to put it all together in a course pack that students ideally should be given prior to our not being able to meet them for some time. Unfortunately, classes were suspended before we could prepare the course packs. However, I know that some faculty members do make available course packs to students at the beginning of the semester. So for them, for those courses where faculty members have done that, then the course packs are already with students. If they are not yet with students, we will need to find a way of providing or delivering them to the students. The course pack components are the detailed course guide, the learning resources for each topic, which may be in the form of photocopies of chapters, journal articles, or they may be offline or PDF files that you might have given your students at some earlier date. Uh, and other things. There are other resources, of course, that are online, like web pages, websites, databases that they may be able to access only if they had the link to those resources. But an equally important part of the course pack are the activity guides themselves and the assignment guides. Without the guides, it's very difficult for students to be able to do the activity that we would like them to do. So let me just show you a couple of examples. One example of an activity guide is what you're looking at on your screen. It says, read Robert Reiser's account of the history of instructional design. See the attached PDF file. And answer the following questions. So there are 3 questions that are given. The last paragraph says, post your answer to one or all of the questions above in the discussion forum for Module 1. In this particular example, we can surmise that there is a discussion forum somewhere that the students know about and have access to. The interesting the aspects of this example that I'd like you to pay attention to is, one, that there is a resource that was given to the students that they must read first before they do anything else. The second is that study questions are provided. This is to ensure that students read productively. And 3, there is clear instruction with regard to where answers are supposed to be placed, or how answers are supposed to be communicated. Okay? So this is an example of a guide that does its job. It gives complete guidance. Okay? Another example is the following activity box. It says, read the overview of instructional design provided by Molenda, Regeluth, and Nelson. A link to this article is available at the course site under Module 1. So again, we can surmise that there is an online course site somewhere on a virtual learning environment or a learning management system. And articles that students are supposed to read are uploaded there, or links to those articles are provided. And then the instructions this time are numbered. First, it says, as you read the article, use a table like the one below to take note of the learning theories and models mentioned in the article and the ID or instructional design principles derived from them. So this is an example of a graphic organizer. You are helping the student take systematic notes using this particular table. And then the second question is, which of the ID principles in the synthesis that is provided on page 6 of the article appeals to you the most, and why? And there's a third question. It says the article makes the point that ID is practiced in various contexts. What would be an example of ID practice in your own context? And then again, at the end, there is an instruction with regard to how students are to communicate their answers. It says, be ready to share your answers to some or all of the questions in the discussion forum for Module 1. So the same items are highlighted for emphasis. There is the resource, a learning resource that students are supposed to read is given. Instructions with regard to how to read are provided. There is a signposting of particular sections of the article that they must pay attention to. And there is a specific or an explicit instruction with regard to how responses are supposed to be communicated. The other item in the course pack that I mentioned is the assignment guide. What is that, and how does it differ from the activity guide? Basically, an assignment is also an activity. It's just that normally we think about assignments as integrative activities or what we call major course requirements. So if you do have such an activity, then it would be advisable to provide a detailed guide that students can follow in order for them to be able to accomplish the task or the assignment. So this is an example. The due date and the grade equivalent is provided. The task is described explicitly. Write an essay of no more than 1,500 words, applying the theoretical concepts on distance education that were discussed in modules 1 to 5, etc. And then a definition of terms is given because, as you know, when you give a course requirement to students orally in the classroom, they usually have a number of questions that they ask, including what certain terms in the assignment means. So in this instance, I think it would be better to provide a definition of terms. And then there are specific guidelines. You can number them, or you can also relabel. Instead of saying specific guidelines, you can say procedure if it is a procedure you're providing. In this instance, in this example, more than 10 items or specific guidelines were provided. And then finally, we need to tell students how their work will be evaluated. What would be the criteria for assessment and evaluation? So that, in effect, they can do a self-assessment or a self-evaluation before they even submit the assignment to you. Okay. So in this particular sample, I'm only highlighting some excerpts. All right, we're coming to the last couple of items, and this time we're abstracting principles or general guidelines. When we are designing learning activities, the following guidelines would be particularly useful to keep in mind. One, we need to ensure alignment of the activity with our target learning outcomes. Why are we making them do the activity? What is it that they're supposed to learn? Secondly, we need to provide clear and complete guidance on how the activity is supposed to be done. Third, we need to provide all of our students with the learning resources that they need in order to do the activity. And this is why the course pack is important. They might know what the activity is, but they do not have the resources that they need to do it. Then, we cannot realistically and reasonably expect them to complete it. And finally, we need to ensure that our students have access to and that they can use the tool or the platform that we have selected for this particular activity. This is very important, keeping in mind the scenario with regard to access to learning technologies that we discussed previously. But the other important thing to consider is whether it is all students that have access. And that brings us to even more general principles of design for learning. The first is the need to practice what is referred to as inclusive instructional design. What is that? One, we need to recognize the diversity and uniqueness of our learners in terms of their capabilities, in terms of their access to resources, such that we must understand and accept that it is not true that one size can fit everyone. It is, one size does not fit all. Which means to say, therefore, that we will need to be ready to provide differentiated instruction. At the very least, what that means is that we should provide resources and activities in multiple formats. We should use multiple tools so that those with access to only one format can continue to learn, and others who have access to more sophisticated formats have a choice to use that format. Um, so, for example, in terms of when we say format, what does that mean? In terms of types of resources, some of us have been, I think, doing crash courses in how to do video lectures. But if we were practicing inclusive instructional design when it comes to the production of videos, we will need to think about how it's not just the audio and the visual that we will need to worry about. It's also thinking about whether all of our students can actually play the video, and if not, then what would be the option for students who cannot view it? Uh, we will need to think about providing transcriptions, text-based versions of what is in the video lecture, for example, such as notes or handouts. Okay? Essentially, when we are practicing inclusive instructional design, we are thinking about diversity, we are thinking about access, and we are committing ourselves to ensuring that no student is left behind. Another general principle that should be observed is the need to develop independent learning skills in our students. Given the scenario of our students having to learn on their own without our supervision all the time. We are not physically present in the same classroom to be able to direct them, to be able to provide instructions. So therefore, we will need to provide very detailed guides, complete guides, in order that they can begin to learn how to study on their own and become independent learners. We will need to provide some form of mentoring and feedback, which can be challenging in a scenario where communication technologies are not available for all. In a scenario, especially in a scenario where online learning can be done only to a limited extent. So this is something we need to think about. And we also need to figure out how to provide, how to foster learner engagement and interaction, not just with us, but also with fellow learners. Here is a diagram about, this is a proposition, I think by Moore, about what deep learning looks like in terms of the types of interaction that ought to be present and which a teacher needs to foster. One is that the learner needs to be able to interact with the content. And that is the point of providing a learning activity guide. And that's the point also of providing the actual learning resource with which the learner will interact. But the learner also needs to be able to interact with us, with the teacher, of course, and that is the purpose of mentoring and feedback and providing explicit instruction. But in addition, ideally, learners should be able to learn collaboratively with other learners. Essentially, learning is very interactive. It is a social activity. The problem is that we are in a situation where not all of these forms of interaction can be provided for, and that's part of that's certainly a major constraint. And perhaps at this juncture, it may be useful to think about Anderson's equivalency theorem. There are two theses. I will share with you only one, and if you want to know what the other thesis is, it's very much related. You can find out for yourself. Anderson here is Terry Anderson, and he came out with this idea that deep and meaningful formal learning can be supported as long as one of the three forms of interaction is at a high level. Okay, we know what the three forms of interaction are, right? Learner content, learner learner, learner teacher. Uh, in an emergency situation, you cannot have all three, but that's all right. It doesn't mean that learning has to be superficial, provided that at least one of these three types of interaction is at a high level. The other two may be offered at minimal levels or even eliminated altogether without degrading the educational experience. That's a proposition, it's a thesis. You may or may not agree with it, but I would suggest that we think about it more closely and go back to our experiences and see the extent to which the theorem is can be proven. Okay, to follow the metaphor. So, in closing, as a concluding note, and apropos that theory about equivalency, we might wish to think about some of these thoughts that professor named Devon Peñas of the University of Washington is supposed to have shared. Some of you might have seen this on Facebook. It's pedagogy in the time of pandemic. I'm highlighting, there are 10 notes that Professor Peñas supposedly articulated under the pedagogy in the time of pandemic. But I'm highlighting here just a few things. The first is the need to be kind. Be kind to yourself, but also be kind to your students. We are all stressed. We are all worrying about whether we have contracted the virus, whether we are likely to contract it. Any symptom that we have might be causing us grave anxiety. So the stress levels are very high. We should not therefore insist on adding to the stress by insisting on the same deadlines, the same teaching and learning activities that we would be doing if we were not in this situation. Some of us may be playing it cool, even our students, but that doesn't mean we are not worrying. The second thing, which is actually number 3 in Peñas's list, is we need to remember that we are not, the situation is not the best possible situation. As he says, we cannot therefore be putting in place the best practices. That's not the situation we're in. We are in triage, triage, however you want to pronounce it. If we had time to plan, distance learning or distance education can be really good or even excellent. But that's not where we are. So we just need to do what we absolutely have to and ditch everything else. We cannot manage to do everything and to do it very well or excellently in a day or a week. And so let's not think about that. We need to prioritize. Again, what do students really need to know for the next couple of weeks? You might think that cherry picking will result in a decline of quality. That's fine. Remember, this is an emergency situation. And it is not a normal time at all. These are not normal circumstances. The best thing we can do if we are really hell-bent on doing something that is the best, the best thing we can do is to stay in contact with our students and to be as transparent as possible about why we are doing certain things, why we are prioritizing certain things, including why we are insisting on some degree of continuity in our teaching and learning activities. There's an item here about making videos and how it should be capsule videos. I don't know if I'm violating that already with this particular webcast. But the other thing is that if you're going to do videos, you should make sure they are short, and you must provide a transcription just in case the video doesn't play or it doesn't play well. If you're going to be giving students assignments, could you please make them zero stakes or no stakes assignment first? The aim is to simply practice the students in this new way of learning, get them used to it, familiarize. We do not have to be doing tests at this point in time. We shouldn't, actually. Given that we are all stressed, we cannot expect people to be thinking about academic concerns, really, and we're simply trying to stay engaged. Okay, so we need to be kind, but especially we need to be kind to our students who are graduating. I didn't think about that actually until last night, when I saw also on Facebook somebody posting a prayer for graduating seniors, because if we are stressed, imagine the stress of students whose graduation now hangs in the balance, whose graduation is now uncertain, because we do not know how long we will stay in lockdown. The epidemiological predictions are that this thing is going to peak not next week, not tomorrow, but in May. Let's hope that the quarantine puts a stop to that and reverses that scenario, and we can get back to normal as soon as possible. But really, the point is that when we are designing learning experiences, we need to be very much aware of the context. We need to think about what's available, what's realistically doable, and we really, really need to think about what is absolutely necessary. Everything else is irrelevant. So that's it, folks. I hope, as I started out by saying that some of these things, if not all of these things, we already know, but I guess we need to remind ourselves. So thank you, and keep safe.